In the heart of a galaxy torn apart by endless war, an unprecedented event unfolds. A human warship, the Exodus, emerges from the void, appearing in the middle of an all-out battlefield where no human should dare venture. Surrounded by fleets of ancient, battle-hardened empires, the Exodus should have been destroyed within moments. Instead, it stands untouched, its movements unpredictable, its power unimaginable. As the galaxy's greatest forces scramble in confusion and terror, one question echoes through the void: what happens when a human warship enters the battlefield? The answer will shatter everything they thought they knew about war. The day the Exodus appeared was like any other in the galaxy. Chaos and destruction were the backdrop of interstellar life, a constant hum of military ships zipping across the vast expanse. The war between the Krosky Empire and the Zenith Coalition had been dragging on for decades. Nothing could break the stalemate. The galaxy was locked in a long, drawn-out struggle for dominance, where one side gained a bit of ground, only to lose it again within weeks, or sometimes days. The only certainty was that the war would never end. Not in our lifetime, and probably not in the lifetimes of anyone who came after. That was the prevailing belief, at least. No one expected the Exodus. No one even knew it existed anymore. For years it had been nothing more than a myth, a story told to children to keep their hopes alive when they saw the horror of war and felt its crushing weight on their families. It was the legend of humanity's first warship, an experimental design lost to time. A ship that had supposedly disappeared into the void of deep space during its maiden voyage. The universe had long moved on from such old stories, and yet there it was, the Exodus, emerging out of nowhere, silently sliding through the vastness of the battlefield with a precision no one could comprehend. Its arrival was like a stone dropped into a pond, ripples spread out, unsettling everything. At first it was barely noticed. The Krosky and Zenith fleets, entrenched in their centuries-old war, were so fixated on each other that the arrival of a single ship barely registered. But the longer it stayed there, unmoving, the more the realization hit: this wasn't just any ship. It couldn't be. No one knew how it had gotten there. No one knew who was aboard it, or why it was there. There were no communications, no signals. The Exodus didn't announce its presence. It didn't send out a challenge or threaten anyone. It simply arrived. Its hull, dark and sleek, reflected the stars around it, as if mocking the chaos in every direction. No one could understand how something so advanced, so powerful could have appeared without warning. No one was prepared for what was coming. The first few moments were filled with disbelief. The fleets continued to clash, unaware that the entire paradigm was about to shift. But then came the first salvo. A Zenith cruiser, more than twice the size of the Exodus, locked on and fired a volley of high-powered energy blasts designed to obliterate anything in their path. The Exodus didn't move. It didn't even attempt to evade the incoming assault. It just stood there, a dark sentinel in the midst of a storm. The blasts hit its hull, and for a moment nothing happened. A collective breath was held across the battlefield. The Zenith ships watched, waiting for the inevitable explosion. And then nothing. The ship didn't shatter. It didn't even show a hint of damage. The energy blasts, which should have torn through the human vessel with ease, simply bounced off. The Zenith fleet commander issued a second volley, the intensity of the weapons escalating, their confidence growing. Surely this was some sort of fluke, some malfunction, a quirk in the human ship's systems. The second barrage slammed into the Exodus with even more force than the first. Again, it looked like the ship might finally crack. But once again it held firm. Not a single dent appeared. Not a single flicker of weakness. The silence that followed was deafening. The rest of the battlefield paused for a moment, as if the entire galaxy was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. But the Exodus didn't move. It remained there, suspended in the middle of an ongoing war, a black stone in a sea of fire. The Krosky and Zenith fleets suddenly seemed less sure of themselves. For the first time in years, they began to hesitate. Could it be true? Could this human warship, this tiny, insignificant speck in the grand scale of the war, really be the thing that turned the tide? The human warship didn't fire back. It didn't need to. Its very presence, the impossibility of its resilience, was enough to shake the confidence of the largest and most advanced fleets in the galaxy. For the first time, they weren't the ones in control. It was a small ship, but it was more than just a physical presence. It was something far worse. A challenge to everything the galactic empires had built. Something they could not understand. And perhaps most frightening of all, something they could not defeat. The Exodus hadn't moved an inch since its arrival, but the galaxy was beginning to feel the tremors of its existence, and that was just the beginning. This ship, this legend of humanity, had returned to the galaxy not to fight a war but to change it. To show the universe something it had never seen before. The first few shots were only the beginning. The initial shock of the Exodus's arrival began to wear off, but the unease that it left behind was just starting to build. Across the galaxy, the different fleets Kroski, Zenith, and a dozen other factions had already coordinated their attacks, each aiming to break the stalemate in their favor. The battlefield, a chaotic expanse of burning ships and shattered alliances, had become a horrific spectacle. Yet now all eyes were on the human ship, suspended in the center of it all. What was this ship? Where had it come from? And why, of all places, had it appeared right in the middle of a war zone? At first it seemed like a fluke, a mistake, a miscalculation, or a simple anomaly. No one had expected the Exodus to survive the initial volley. It had been a single ship, alone, facing off against entire fleets. That kind of disparity should have spelled its doom. The Exodus shouldn't have been able to endure, much less stand its ground. But it had, and with every passing moment, the situation became more perplexing. The Kroski and Zenith forces, despite their overwhelming numbers, didn't know how to react. Every captain, every commander, had learned a universal truth over the centuries. Numbers mattered. Strategy mattered. Experience and firepower could turn the tide of any battle, no matter how insurmountable the odds seemed. But here now they were faced with something else entirely, something that defied their understanding of war itself. The Exodus had done nothing but endure, and that alone had rattled the very core of their confidence. For hours, the Exodus remained motionless, as if daring anyone to challenge it. The alien fleets, once so certain of their superiority, now watched in confusion, their leaders scrambling to make sense of what had just transpired. It didn't take long before they began to act, forming new strategies, new plans. The realization had set in. The Exodus wasn't some lost relic of humanity's past. It was a weapon. A weapon that had appeared from nowhere, in the middle of a war, and now they had to deal with it. But no one knew how. The Kroski Empire, usually quick to strike at the smallest sign of weakness, sent out a reconnaissance ship to assess the human warship. The vessel was small, a sleek scout meant for gathering intelligence and evading enemy fire. It had been designed to move quickly, to blend into the chaos of war. But the commander aboard had miscalculated. Without warning, the Exodus moved. In a flash, it was no longer stationary. The human ship accelerated at an unnatural rate, weaving between the debris of destroyed ships with an ease that defied all known physics. The scout ship didn't stand a chance. Within moments, it was torn apart, shredded by a barrage of energy beams so precise, so deadly, that it seemed as though the Exodus had known exactly where to strike. There was no warning, no attempt to communicate. It simply destroyed the reconnaissance ship as though it were an afterthought. The alien fleets watched in stunned silence. The Kroski Empire had sent a scout to gauge the human warship's capabilities, and now it was gone, disintegrated into space dust. If that had been the first shot fired from the Exodus, it would have been one thing, but it wasn't. The human warship hadn't even made a move until the enemy had tried to approach it. It had waited, choosing to make its strike only when necessary, when provoked. The Zenith fleet, not wanting to be outdone, now began to strategize. They were more experienced, more tactically minded than the Kroski. They were known for their ability to read a battlefield, to predict the movements of their enemies with near-perfect precision. But against the Exodus, they could see nothing to predict. There was no pattern to the ship's movements. The Exodus didn't adhere to any of the conventions of battle that the Zenith had spent centuries perfecting. They realized, too late, that the rules had changed. So, they fired. A volley of high-powered disruptor beams rained down upon the Exodus, designed to penetrate its hull and overload its energy systems. The alien fleet assumed the human ship, though resilient, would eventually buckle under the pressure. The Exodus would falter, break apart, and become just another casualty in the endless war. But once again, they were wrong. The Exodus didn't just absorb the blows. It didn't simply resist the energy blasts as it had earlier. No, this time it did something far more unexpected. It seemed to disappear. Not in a physical sense, but in the way it moved. The ship blurred, shifting through space so quickly that it seemed to be in multiple places at once. The Zenith commanders tried to track its movement, but it was impossible. One moment the Exodus was on one side of the battlefield, and in the next it was on the other, bypassing entire fleets with an ease that defied logic. And then, just as the Zenith were beginning to regroup and retaliate, the Exodus struck again. But this time it wasn't just a few shots, it was a relentless barrage. A rapid, unyielding stream of energy that ripped through the heart of the Zenith formation. Ships were torn apart instantly, their hulls crumpling as if made of paper. The fleet scattered, in full retreat, unable to withstand the raw fury of the human warship. In the chaos that followed, the battlefield shifted. The Zenith had failed. The Krusky were no better off, their fleets now scattered and confused. No one knew what had just happened or how to respond. The Exodus had done nothing but show up, and in doing so it had already begun to break the will of the most powerful fleets in the galaxy. The very nature of war had been altered, and the aliens were now learning a lesson they would never forget. This was only the beginning. The battlefield was a scene of utter chaos. But amid the destruction, one thing had become abundantly clear. The Exodus was not like any ship the galaxy had ever encountered. It wasn't just its resilience, nor its ability to defy all known laws of physics. There was something about the human warship that struck at the very heart of what it meant to wage war. The other fleets, now fractured and reeling from their failed attempts to neutralize the Exodus, were forced to come to terms with the impossible. The Exodus was more than just a weapon, it was a symbol. The shockwaves from the Exodus's arrival had shaken the confidence of the galaxy's most powerful empires. The Krusky and Zenith fleets, now retreating in disarray, struggled to regroup, each side whispering the same unspoken question: how could one ship have done this? The answer, as it turned out, was simple. The Exodus had done nothing but simply been. It was not the ship's firepower that had caused the immediate retreat of both fleets, nor was it the unprecedented maneuvers. It was the fact that the Exodus was a challenge, a defiance of everything the galactic empires held as true. It made no sense that humanity, a species once thought to be on the fringe of galactic affairs, could suddenly be wielding a force that bent the rules of warfare itself. As the battle raged on, the Exodus seemed almost patient. It wasn't in a hurry. It didn't need to rush or to destroy everything in its path. It just existed quietly, calmly, with an unwavering presence that unnerved every ship around it. Alien fleets, which had once been so sure of their dominance, began to hesitate. The commanders, seasoned veterans who had fought in hundreds of battles, felt a creeping doubt in the pit of their stomachs. What if the humans weren't just fighting for survival? What if they were fighting for something else entirely? The Exodus' next move was a mystery to everyone. It had been sitting there for hours, seemingly inactive, as the alien fleets attempted to reorganize. But the longer it stayed in place, the more its presence began to gnaw at the confidence of the enemy. What did the Exodus want? What was its true purpose? And most terrifying of all, why had it appeared now, when the war had seemed so hopeless, so intractable? Then, without warning, the Exodus moved again. This time it wasn't an instantaneous burst of speed as it had been before. There was no need for the ship to blur across the battlefield in another impossible maneuver. Instead, it slid forward with deliberate purpose, as though the Exodus had all the time in the universe. In that moment, it was clear that it wasn't just the ship itself that was a weapon, it was the crew aboard it. The humans aboard the Exodus knew something no one else did. They knew how to fight differently. The alien fleets watched in stunned silence as the Exodus turned, its sleek form gliding across the expanse of space. The human warship's weapons remained silent, but the sheer force of its presence was enough to shift the balance of the battle once again. There was no fear in the ship, no hesitation. It was as if the Exodus knew that victory was inevitable. Suddenly, the Krusky fleet made its move. They had regrouped, reshuffled their forces, and launched a coordinated offensive. Their ships fired in unison, sending a barrage of energy blasts toward the Exodus, each one larger than the last. This time, they were determined to overwhelm the human ship, to strike it down with the full weight of their might. The blast came at the Exodus from all directions, but it didn't seem to even flinch. As the attacks rained down upon it, the ship's shields flared briefly before the energy dissipated into the void. The Krusky commanders, watching from their flagship, couldn't believe what they were seeing. This wasn't just a question of power anymore. It was as if the Exodus wasn't part of the universe they understood. The human ship was breaking the laws of physics in ways they could never have predicted. It was impossible to track, impossible to hit, and its shields didn't behave like anything in their databases. And yet, it wasn't just the technology that was baffling them, it was the mentality behind it. The Exodus wasn't merely a ship. It was a reflection of the human will, a living testament to a species that had never backed down, never accepted defeat, no matter the odds. As the Krusky fleets faltered, the Zenith, unwilling to be left behind, once again launched their counteroffensive. But their tactics were no better than the Krusky's. They too tried to fire in perfect synchronization to create a barrage so overwhelming that it would have shattered any other vessel. But the Exodus didn't seem to care. It didn't even need to evade. The ship's systems absorbed the blasts as though they were nothing more than raindrops on the surface of an ocean. In that moment, the Zenith forces began to break. It wasn't just the physical damage inflicted on their ships, it was the realization that they couldn't win. They couldn't understand how to fight something like the Exodus. And that, more than anything else, was what made the Exodus so dangerous. It wasn't the raw power of its weaponry, it was the fear it instilled in its enemies. Fear not of defeat, but of complete and utter failure. As the Zenith began to scatter, the Kroski were left with no clear strategy. They had underestimated humanity, and now they were paying the price. But the Exodus was not finished. Its slow, methodical approach to the battle had already begun to win it. The question now was how long it would take for the rest of the galaxy to realize what had just happened, and whether they could even comprehend it before it was too late. The Exodus had turned the battlefield into a graveyard, but it wasn't just by destroying ships. It had done something far worse. It had shattered the illusion of invincibility that the galactic empires had spent centuries building. The Exodus wasn't just a warship. It was a mirror, showing the galaxy something it wasn't ready to see. Humanity had arrived. The events that followed the Exodus's relentless assault were nothing short of catastrophic for the galactic fleets. The war, which had been raging for centuries, was now a distant memory. In an instant, everything changed. It wasn't the devastation of entire fleets that made this moment so profound. It was the realization that no one, not even the most advanced empires in the galaxy, had any idea how to fight the humans. They had faced countless threats before, countless enemies who sought to bring them to their knees. But humanity, this small, seemingly insignificant species, had proven something far more dangerous than just their firepower. They had proven their resilience, their refusal to be beaten. The alien fleets, Kroski and Zenith alike, began to fracture in a way no one had ever expected. Even as their remaining forces regrouped in the aftermath of their failed offensives, there was a subtle shift in the air, a change in the way their commanders spoke, the way their officers moved. It wasn't just about tactics or weapons anymore. It was about fear. And that fear was directed squarely at the Exodus. The Exodus, for its part, was eerily calm. It had obliterated fleets, turned the tide of a battle that should have been lost for humanity, and yet it remained still. The ship no longer needed to demonstrate its power with fire and fury. Its mere presence was enough. But that was part of the plan. Humans never needed to make a spectacle of themselves. They weren't the loudest in the room, the flashiest or the most extravagant. But when they fought with purpose. And that purpose was something the galaxy wasn't prepared for. Inside the ship, the crew remained a mystery. The Exodus had no crew transmissions, no signals. It was as if the ship had no commander at all, as though it were an autonomous force of nature, one that needed no guiding hand. The alien forces couldn't make sense of this either. The Exodus wasn't acting like any warship they had ever encountered. The warships they knew had crews, highly trained officers, tactical leaders, the minds that made the decisions and charted the course. But the Exodus was different. It was like a shadow, an enigma they couldn't wrap their minds around. It didn't make demands or show mercy. It simply existed, and in doing so, it upended everything. And so the commanders, once proud and mighty, now began to ponder the unthinkable. Could they stand against this human force? The Kroski Empire, with its centuries-old tradition of military supremacy, felt the cracks begin to form in their foundation. The Zenith, famed for their strategic brilliance, found themselves fumbling, unsure of how to proceed. The galaxy's established powers, built on principles of strength and dominance, had encountered something they didn't understand, and that was more terrifying than any enemy they had ever faced. The first desperate attempts to stop the Exodus came in the form of a diplomatic meeting. The Kroski and Zenith, unable to reconcile their differences, agreed on one thing: the Exodus had to be destroyed. But the question of how to destroy it remained elusive. No one knew what kind of weapon could bring down a ship that could seemingly deflect and absorb anything thrown at it. The warships they relied on, their greatest weapons, had been useless against it. Still, they had to try. They had no choice. The diplomatic envoys met in the shadow of a nearby asteroid field, their ships floating in silence, devoid of the usual bravado. Their once sturdy alliances had been fractured by the Exodus's simple presence. The Kroski in particular were unnerved. Their empire had always been about force, raw, unyielding power. But here was a ship that didn't respond to power in the way they understood. The Zenith, meanwhile, kept their distance, analyzing the situation with their usual precision. They too were calculating, trying to figure out if there was any chance of reclaiming the advantage. But as the envoys spoke, the answer became increasingly clear. There was no way to defeat the Exodus without understanding it. And that, in itself, was a problem. The alien fleets had long prided themselves on their knowledge of warfare, on the ability to predict and counter any move their enemies made. But humanity was different. They were unpredictable. The exodus itself was unpredictable. Back in the midst of the battlefield, the exodus continued its silent vigil. It had been over a day since its first salvo, yet it hadn't moved an inch from its position. Its hull gleamed in the light of distant stars, an unyielding presence in the middle of the chaos. The alien fleets, despite their fear, continued to try and organize, but there was no unity among them. The Krosky commanders, who had once worked side by side with the Zenith, now found themselves second-guessing their alliances. The Zenith commanders, who had once considered themselves the most brilliant tacticians in the galaxy, now found themselves questioning everything they knew. Meanwhile, the Exodus did nothing. It didn't rush into the fray. It didn't launch another devastating offensive. It merely existed, its presence enough to break the morale of the most powerful fleets in the galaxy. In the silence of space, as fleets hovered in the distance, something profound began to happen. The war didn't matter anymore. The battle didn't matter. What mattered now was the question that no one had considered before the Exodus's arrival. What did the humans want? And more terrifyingly, could they be stopped? The Exodus didn't need to answer. It had already won. It was no longer about conquering planets or winning a war. It was about rewriting the rules of the galaxy. The age of human insignificance was over. In the depths of space, far from the eyes of the galaxy's most powerful empires, humanity had proven they were not just a force to be reckoned with, they were the new definition of strength itself. And the galaxy for the first time would have to adjust to that reality. As the days passed, the situation in the galaxy began to spiral into something no one could have foreseen. The Exodus remained a still, silent enigma, a monolith at the heart of a battlefield littered with the shattered remnants of alien fleets. The once proud Krusky Empire, revered for its immense power and tactical brilliance, had now found itself fractured. The Zenith, renowned for their strategic acumen, were equally adrift, caught in a sea of uncertainty. It was no longer about fighting the Exodus, it was about surviving its existence. The human warship, as strange as it was, had irrevocably altered the nature of this conflict. The galaxy had long been ruled by the principle of strength, where sheer firepower, military alliances, and overwhelming numbers determined the outcome of wars. The aliens had built their entire empires on this foundation, but the Exodus had shattered that foundation in a matter of hours. What had started as a simple act of defiance, the sudden arrival of a single human ship in the middle of the largest battle the galaxy had ever seen, had become a symbol of something far more terrifying, the fragility of everything the galaxy thought it knew. The alien leaders Krosky, Zenith, and even the smaller factions that had been swept up in the conflict had to contend with a new reality. How do you fight something that refuses to be defeated? And yet, even in the midst of the chaos, there was no sign of the humans. No formal declaration, no communication, no demands. The Exodus hadn't made any moves for days. It had simply sat there, unmoving, watching as the other fleets slowly crumbled in the wake of their own hesitation. The alien commanders had hoped for a flaw, a mistake, something they could exploit to regain control of the situation. But there was nothing. The Exodus didn't make mistakes. It didn't even need to act to win. In the absence of direct engagement, the fleets began to disband. Krosky ships limped away from the battle, their crews unsure of what had just transpired, questioning their very place in the galaxy. Zenith forces, once so proud, now exchanged quiet, nervous glances. They had tried everything. They had thrown everything they had at the Exodus, and yet it had not even flinched. Now, there was nothing left to do but retreat. The Exodus did not follow. It didn't need to. The galaxies, which had been at war for so long, were now marked by an uneasy peace. The great empires that had once dominated the cosmos, each with their own unique approach to warfare, were now locked in a shared uncertainty. There was no clear victor, no clear enemy. The Exodus had come, and the galaxy was reeling from the implications. The humans hadn't won the battle in any traditional sense. They hadn't destroyed entire fleets or razed planets to the ground. They had done something far worse. They had proven that war was no longer something the galaxy understood. On the fringes of the galaxy, smaller factions began to stir. They were watching the aftermath unfold with wide eyes, aware of the implications but uncertain how to respond. The Exodus had become a topic of conversation, a subject of fearful speculation. What were the humans capable of? What did they want from the galaxy? And more importantly, what would happen when they decided to act? The larger empires, still stunned by their failures, began to hold internal meetings, trying to piece together what had just happened. Their leaders, who had once been so sure of their superiority, were now left scrambling to make sense of a world where humans had become the wild card. The power dynamics had shifted. The balance of the galaxy had tilted, but no one knew in which direction. It was around this time that the first reports began to surface from the distant corners of the galaxy, places far removed from the epicenter of the conflict, where the Exodus had wreaked its havoc. There were rumors, whispers that the human ship wasn't alone. They weren't just a force unto themselves. There were others. Human warships, some even larger than the Exodus, had been seen on the outer edges of known space, advancing steadily, silently, as though they were preparing for something much greater than just one isolated battle. The news spread like wildfire. The empires, already on edge, now found themselves faced with an undeniable truth. The Exodus had not been a fluke. It had not been some rogue ship that had somehow appeared in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a harbinger of something much worse. The Exodus had shown the galaxy that humans could move at will, strike with devastating force, and leave their enemies not just defeated, but confused, uncertain, and broken. But what was their next move? Could they be stopped? And that question, the most terrifying one of all, hung in the air, unanswered. The galaxy had long prided itself on its technological advancements, its tactical superiority, its ability to adapt to any threat. But the humans had introduced something new. They weren't just fighting to win. They weren't fighting for land or power. They were fighting because they refused to lose. And that determination, that sheer unyielding will to survive and to win, was something the galaxy had never encountered. What came next was a question that no one had an answer to. The Exodus had already begun to rewrite the rules of war, and the galaxy, for all its might and knowledge, had no idea how to adapt. The first shockwave had hit, and it was impossible to predict the full extent of its ripple effects. As the galaxy's greatest fleets retreated and reorganized, the fear began to set in. The Exodus was only the beginning. Humanity was no longer a mere footnote in the history of the galaxy. They were the unknown factor, the variable no one had prepared for. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Weeks passed, but the sense of unease never dissipated. The galaxy, which had been brimming with the confidence of its great empires, now seemed on edge, as if the ground beneath it had shifted in ways no one understood. The Exodus had not only defied every expectation, it had altered the very perception of power itself. And now, no one could escape the question that loomed over everything. What happens when humanity decides to act again? The alien empires had failed to defeat the Exodus, there was no denying that. But more than that, they had failed to comprehend the full scope of what it meant for humanity to enter the galactic stage. The Exodus was still out there, silent, patient, as if waiting for something. And it wasn't just the ship itself that haunted the minds of the galaxy's most powerful. It was the humans. No one knew how many ships humanity had. The Exodus was the only one seen, the only one that had revealed itself. But whispers had begun to circulate, rumors that more human warships were emerging at the fringes of known space. No one knew where they had come from, how they had arrived, or if they were even the same type of ship as the Exodus. What was clear, however, was that humanity was not done. The Exodus had been a singular force, a harbinger of something much larger. What the galaxy had assumed to be a fluke was now emerging as the beginning of a terrifying new chapter. Across the galaxy, the alien empires scrambled to adapt. The Kruski, unable to regain their earlier resolve, began to shift focus, trying to reframe the question from one of how to defeat humanity to one of how to coexist with them. It was a difficult pill to swallow. They had spent centuries viewing the galaxy through the lens of dominant strength and numbers, advanced technology and tactical superiority. Now all that seemed irrelevant. How could they compete with a species that had shown no respect for the rules of war, that had attacked without warning and left their fleets shattered? The Zenith, for their part, were more analytical. They tried to learn, to understand. Their vast databanks were scoured for any clue as to why the Exodus had behaved the way it did, why it had been so impossibly invulnerable, why it had been so patient. But the truth was, no one knew. Every attempt to analyze the Exodus technology, its tactics, its behavior, came up empty. There were no traces of its design in any other part of the galaxy. No patterns to follow, no ancient cultures to study, no artifacts left behind by previous civilizations. It was as though the ship and humanity itself had simply appeared out of nowhere, with no forewarning, no history to predict their rise. And so, as the galaxy's greatest minds failed to find answers, a quiet fear began to take hold. What if the humans weren't here just to conquer? What if their only goal was to disrupt, to force the galaxy into a new paradigm, one that could not be controlled, one where no one was truly safe? The Exodus was still out there, floating silently in space, like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The rumors of more human warships began to gain traction. Ships of similar design to the Exodus were reported on the outer rim, seemingly on the move, advancing slowly but surely. There was no sign of aggression, no overt threats. Yet the presence of these ships was enough to send a ripple of fear throughout the galaxy. No one could afford to ignore them. Not anymore. Meanwhile, the Exodus continued to do what it had done since its arrival: nothing. Its sheer presence, its refusal to act, was enough to make entire fleets hesitate. The Krosky and Zenith, their respective empires now divided and uncertain, began to question their own motives. Had they been so sure of themselves before? Had they miscalculated the entire nature of warfare? It was impossible to ignore that the Exodus had forced them into a situation they couldn't control. Their armies, their fleets, their technological advantages, none of it had worked. And now they were left in a limbo of uncertainty. The larger question, of course, was what the Exodus represented. The ship was a message, not just from humanity, but about humanity. It was an embodiment of their refusal to be destroyed, their relentless drive to survive, and, perhaps most dangerously, their capacity to adapt and evolve. Unlike the empires that had existed for millennia, humanity was not locked into an unchanging cycle of power and dominance. They were unpredictable, fluid, and capable of surprising the galaxy at every turn. The Exodus was only the beginning. As the human fleet, whatever it might be, moved forward from the edges of the galaxy, the empires now faced an unprecedented dilemma. How do you negotiate with an enemy you don't understand? How do you fight a species that doesn't follow the rules of warfare, that seems to possess not just strength, but an unyielding spirit? Humanity had already shown that it wasn't like anything they had encountered before. The galaxy's finest commanders had thrown everything they had at the Exodus and failed. And now the human warships that were rumored to be on the move could prove to be even more devastating. This realization spread through the ranks of the Krosky and Zenith, as well as the other smaller factions that had once been content to sit on the sidelines. The galaxy was changing, and not everyone knew how to handle it. Alliances were tested. Old rivalries flared up. The fabric of the known universe was shifting, and no one knew where it would land. The only certainty was this: humanity was here. And they were not going away. The Exodus had proven that much. As the fear of the unknown crept through the ranks of the alien empires, there was no longer any question about humanity's place in the galaxy. They had taken their first steps onto the battlefield, and the galaxy was left to wonder how long it would take for the next human strike to come and what would happen when it did. The question was no longer if humanity could be stopped. It was when they would be ready to stop everyone else. The silence stretched across the galaxy like a suffocating veil. In the wake of humanity's unrelenting force, the once proud empires had retreated to their corners, licking their wounds, trying to make sense of the new order they found themselves in. The Exodus had made its mark. It had torn through the heart of the galaxy's power, shattering their sense of invulnerability. But even more unsettling was the absence of anything definitive. The Exodus still floated out there, its looming presence a constant reminder of humanity's potential. Days turned to weeks, and the tension only grew. It wasn't just the fear of what the Exodus could do, it was the fear of what it represented. Humanity's refusal to be pushed around, their ability to survive in ways the galaxy had never anticipated, had created a new paradigm. A paradigm where even the mightiest fleets of the galaxy were powerless. But what happened next? What came after the Exodus' first strike? What was the true depth of humanity's power? And could anyone withstand it? In the aftermath of the battle, the alien empires began to regroup. But it was clear they weren't the same. The Krosky, once known for their brutal, unyielding nature, had grown introspective. They had always prided themselves on their overwhelming strength, their ability to dominate through sheer force, but now they were questioning everything. They couldn't deny it anymore. They had lost. The Exodus had proven that the rules of war weren't the same when humanity was involved. The Zenith, as calculating and precise as they were, now found themselves pondering an even more pressing question: was it worth it to fight? How could they go to war against a species that showed no signs of weakness? Meanwhile, the human warships rumored to be multiplying in the far reaches of space remained a mystery. There were whispers that entire fleets of these ships were assembling on the outskirts of the galaxy, preparing for a new campaign. But even as the Empire sent scouts to investigate, they found nothing. The human ships were elusive, appearing only in flashes of light before disappearing once again into the void. It was like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. What was their purpose? What was their next move? The uncertainty gnawed at the minds of every alien leader. The Exodus in particular became a focal point of this growing dread. It had never moved from its position, sitting like an immovable titan at the center of the galaxy's fractured heart. Its passive stance was unsettling. It didn't need to strike, it was already winning. And as the days dragged on, the fear among the alien forces grew, not because of what the Exodus had done, but because of what it had not done. It had proven its power, but it had withheld its wrath. What would happen when it finally chose to act? What would it look like when humanity decided it was time to move? The alliances that once seemed unbreakable were now in flux. The Kroski and Zenith, once united in their desire to destroy the human threat, now found themselves suspicious of each other. They had been brought together by necessity, but their failure to overcome the Exodus had exposed their vulnerabilities. Their empires had been built on the assumption that they were the most powerful forces in the galaxy, but that assumption had been shattered. They no longer knew who their enemies were, or whether they could still trust the allies they had once relied on. Each faction now looked over its shoulder, wondering if the others might be preparing to strike first, fearful that anyone could be the next target. In a desperate attempt to restore some semblance of order, the leaders of the galactic powers began to meet. It wasn't a grand summit. It was more of a quiet exchange of fragmented ideas, each one trying to form a strategy for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. They all understood the same thing now: humanity was not the problem, it was the unknown that terrified them. The Exodus was a symbol of something far worse, the possibility that humanity's entire approach to warfare was a paradigm shift the galaxy had no answer for. And that was when the first human message came. It was delivered with eerie calm. It didn't carry any immediate threat. No declarations of war, no demands for submission. It wasn't even broadcast to all the powers at once. It was directed specifically to the leaders of the Kroski, the Zenith, and the other empires that had suffered at the hands of the Exodus. The message was simple, concise, and devoid of the usual pomp that often accompanied galactic declarations. It simply said, "We're watching. When you're ready, we'll be waiting." No one knew what that meant. But in the silence that followed, something shifted. There was no fanfare, no grand victory speech, just the words, cold and direct. And with those words, the galaxy's fears deepened. It wasn't just a statement of intent. It was a promise, an assurance that humanity was not just a passing threat, it was a force waiting patiently to reshape the galaxy on their own terms. The silence that followed was suffocating. The Exodus, still in its place, had not moved. But that single message had ignited a spark in the minds of the galaxy's leaders. What had they been fighting for? Was it worth it? Was it possible to beat humanity at their own game? Or had they already lost? The truth was more unsettling than anyone cared to admit. Humanity wasn't just a species trying to survive, they were now a force to be reckoned with, a power the galaxy had never seen before. The Exodus had been the first warning shot. The galaxy had been given a taste of what was to come, and now it was left to wonder whether anyone could rise to meet the challenge or if they would be consumed by it. In the vastness of space, with no answers and no plan, the galaxy waited, caught in a moment of suspended dread. Humanity was still out there, watching, waiting, and the rest of the galaxy could only wonder, what would it take to survive the next wave? And more terrifyingly, was there anyone left who would dare to fight back? As the stars glimmered, casting their cold light over the galaxy, one thing became painfully clear: humanity was no longer a footnote in the universe's grand history. The Exodus had delivered its message, but it was only the beginning. The galaxy had learned to fear the unknown, but the truth was, they hadn't seen anything yet. Humanity wasn't here to conquer, it was here to reshape the very fabric of existence. And when the galaxy finally understood that, it would be too late. What will the galaxy do when humanity steps forward once again? Only time will tell, but remember, we're watching. And when we're ready, we'll be waiting. If you've enjoyed this ride through the edges of the galaxy, don't forget to subscribe to Sci-Fi Horizon Stories, where humanity's most unpredictable weapon is always just around the corner. Stay tuned because you won't want to miss what comes next.